Okay, hello everybody, welcome to this final module of this 4-module advanced bid writing course for the National Archives. It's just a reminder, and for those who just joined us, we are recording today's session. If you can remind, just some housekeeping things, if you can please keep yourself muted until there's such point as it's time for questions, that would be great. Please do use the chat box to introduce yourselves, but also ask any questions throughout the session. If you have any administration questions, Richard is here ably helping me today, and I am having a few technical challenges, so if it all goes wrong, he is absolutely delighted to jump in and help out. Thanks, Richard. Just a quick reminder, my name is Leah Sellinger. I've been working in the charity sector for about 17 years and a big fundraising background, so trying to help you learn as much as possible about advanced bid writing this evening. So today is the fourth of our 4 modules, and just a reminder, module 1 we talked about deciding when to bid and where to look. In modules 2 and 3 we talked about elements of a case for support, so needs, solutions, impact, and including thinking about theory of change and what makes you unique and added value. And finally, module 4 is where we are today. We're going to be talking about budget and full cost recovery. I'm a full cost recovery geek and love numbers, so this is my favourite part. And then we're going to talk about what happens when you actually get the money. What do you do about stewardship and reporting? So keeping your donors feeling loved and keeping them on board. So just a reminder of the case for support modules the sections that we've been to. We talked about need, and we talked about demonstrating that and really thinking about putting yourself in the donor's shoes. We thought about solutions, and is that the right solution, and thinking about co-producing those. We talked about impact and think about what the difference in impact and outcomes are and how a theory of change model can help you. And we talked about why you, what's your USP in the 3rd module. So today we're going to talk about money and how much you need, and where it's going to come from. So really by budget, that's what we mean. How much the work will cost, what the key areas of expenditure are, but really importantly, where you're planning to get the funding from. And today we're going to focus on this concept of full cost recovery, what it is, how to use it, and why it's important. So just if in the chat, if you let me know, has anyone used a full cost recovery methodology or come across it either in their current roles or similar? Just give me a yes or no or something in the chat. It's useful to know. Oh, fantastic. Rosie does. Brilliant. So there's a couple of people might have done. Yep. Yes and a no. Fantastic. So I think today, for those of you who you'll see in Rosie in a second. I think that's pretty in sec. But yeah, there's some have used it, some haven't. So I think those of you who know a bit more about it, bear with me. Those of you who are new to it, hopefully this will be an introduction, and hopefully those who have come across it will learn a bit. So good to see we've got a mix of experiences in the room. And yes, National Lottery do talk a lot about full cost recovery. Absolutely right. So thank you to somebody said that, was Rosie mentioned that. And here's a quote from them to define what full cost recovery is. And it means securing funding for all the costs involved in running a project. So it means you can request funding for both the direct project costs and a proportion of the organisation's what they call overheads. And I'll talk a bit about why I don't like the word overheads anymore, but the other costs that the organisation has that aren't necessarily direct project costs. So we're going to explore what some of these terms mean, and we're going to explore how full cost recovery methodology works and some of the challenges and opportunities it presents you as an organisation using it. So the terminology, what do we mean by it? So for full cost recovery methodology, what you need to really think about is there are direct costs for an organisation, and direct costs are what we might know as project costs or variable costs. They're the costs that relate clearly and directly to a project or activity. So, for example, staff who are employed just to work on that project, volunteer costs for a particular activity, marketing and promotional costs, for example, if you need to hire space for the project to take place, or anything you might buy for that, be that items of storage or facilities, might be bigger items, so computers, for example. And indirect costs is what we also heard about, things like core costs, fixed costs, because they don't vary as much, or the word overheads. And they're the costs that support the project, but also support other activities. So you might have a manager or someone who's working in administration or human resources in your organisation who supports that project you're applying for funding for, that the direct costs are for, but also other projects and activities. So office costs would also fall into this thing, so rent, utilities and so on. and also things that you just need to exist in the organisation. So, for example, legal and audit fees. So those costs are relatively fixed. They're unlikely to change significantly if you go from, say, running 2 to 3 projects. There may be a bit more management time and so on, but they're relatively fixed costs, hence the term fixed, rather than your direct costs, which are variable. And I don't really like the word overheads, because I think actually all costs are really important. And the direct or indirect, they're absolutely there. Overheads suggest they're a kind of a burden, there's something extra. And actually, I don't think they are. They're essential costs, and you really have to understand how you're going to cover them. And that's what a full cost recovery methodology does do. So we're going to talk about how a full cost recovery methodology works, and how do you make sure that you apportion and allow for indirect costs when you budget how much a project costs. So I'm going to talk you through an example, and it's a very much a simplified example based on the Chiltern Cultural Trust, which we've used a couple of other examples from before. Remember, this is a made-up example, and it has been heavily simplified to help you understand the concepts. I totally appreciate that reality can be very different, and this is a very simplified version with just an organisation running 2 projects, as you'll see. But just bear in mind, this is just about methodology. This is how to understand the concept and to show you how you might be able to use it. So this organisation's got a budget of £165,000 a year, and you can see they've got direct costs, so they've got outreach, they've got volunteer, they've got exhibition costs, and they've got staff salary costs, and they've got their indirect costs and management, office costs and governance and so on. And you can see those are broken down as direct and indirect, so their total budget is about £165,000 a year. Now, CCT, which I'm going to call them because Chiltern Cultural Trust is a bit of a mouthful, has currently delivering 2 projects. It's got the History Spies and Chiltern Roots. History Spies is a project that works with school groups who come to the Trust venue as part of a regular programme of school trips. So it needs the less direct costs and less staff time to run. Chiltern Roots, on the other hand, is something that's it relies on volunteer time for delivery. It requires a lot more outreach, and there's more staff costs. So you can see the two projects have very different costings. At the moment, our indirect costs are sitting out there on their own. They're not allocated anywhere, and they aren't apportioned to any one project. So actually, they aren't very easy to raise money for. As we know, there's very few funders who will just fund your core costs or overheads, for example. They want to fund projects. So the best way to do that is to apportion our indirect costs to a project to make them easier to fundraise for. And we're going to do that by identifying a cost driver to decide how to apportion these. Now, the cost driver, and I'll explain a bit more what I mean by cost driver in a moment, is we're going to use on this example is full-time staff. And I'll go into more detail about it in a moment, but you can see from this project, we know that we have 3 full-time staff working for CCT, doing 35 hours a week. So there's 105 hours of staff time in a week. We know that over on average, we've got the CCT have got 25 hours of staff time being delivered in the History Spies, and they have a further 80 hours a week being delivered on Chiltern Roots. So that's how the 105 breaks down. And we can see that 24% of the time versus 76% of the time is that. And that's the figure we're going to use as our cost driver. Now, I've chosen to use staff time here, but I could have chosen to use volunteer time. I could have chosen to use beneficiary numbers. I could have chosen to use hours of delivery, floor space. Doesn't matter what your cost driver is, and your unique project and the way that you work will determine what your cost driver is. What a cost driver has to do is be something that all projects have in common. So we've chosen to use staff time here. I could have chosen to use, for example, volunteer time, but actually, because volunteer time is really uneven in the work that I've done here, the Chiltern Roots project is much more heavily reliant on volunteers. It's not a good cost driver for you to be used because it skews the way I'll apportion my indirect costs unevenly and unfairly, whereas staff time is relatively fair. So I've used that, and it needs to be consistent across all projects. So you need to decide for you what that might be. And so it could be beneficiaries, it could be hours delivered, and so on. So I've worked out my cost driver, and I've determined that it's 24% and 76%. And so I'm going to use my 24 and 76% to allocate out my indirect costs in that way, to apportion my indirect costs to the projects that CCT are delivering. So management costs of £40,000 times that by 24% is 9,600, and 76% is 30,400. So we apportion the indirect costs proportionately in line with that cost driver. So we do that all the way down those headings in my indirect costs, and what we end up with is our full cost recovery model. Our full cost of running History Spies is not 25 grand, it's actually 38,200. And likewise, the true cost of running Chiltern Routes is £126,000. So this is a very, very simple version of how it can work with very small numbers, and it just shows you the theory, and it also shows you the risk of what some organisations do, which is to go, oh, just allocate 10%, add 10%, that will cover your core costs, that will cover your overheads, which is fine if the true cost is 10%. But as you can see in this example, actually the cost of indirect costs is closer to 45% of the project. So if they just added 10% each time, at the end of the year, they're going to be left with 35% of their organisation's expenditure unfunded. And not only that, it's going to be the indirect costs that are unfunded, the hardest bit to fundraise for. Now, you might know, for example, that you have core funding from a local authority, from a grant funder, from donations from individuals, whatever it is. You might know that you have unrestricted income or donations coming in that covers that balance. And if you do, that's absolutely fine. But you need to understand that, and you need to understand the risk of it. We talked about in this afternoon session, somebody asked about, well, what if you do have match funding? Do you need to think about that? If you have like core funding, do you need to allow for it or just take it out of a full cost recovery model? And the fact is that you still need to allow for it, because there's a risk if that funding disappears for whatever reason, if there's budget cuts at a local council, for example, and that funding goes, you still need to replace it. So you still need to understand the true cost, even if some of those costs are already covered. It's the cost rather than where your money's coming from that you're trying to understand. I'm going to look at now, if there's any questions, do let me know in the chat as we go along. I'm going to move on to look at how we use this knowledge, how we use this methodology in actually our fundraising activities. So we're going to take one of the projects. We're going to take Chiltern Routes, which is our project that costs just under £127,000, and we're going to think about where can we get the money from for it. Well, one of our funders is going to give us an in-kind gift. So this is the owner of the venue that CCT will plan to use for exhibition, has offered it for pro bono, and it's worth £4,000. So they still need to buy the materials, so it's not completely written off that budget line, but it has reduced the amount to fine to £122,000. I did a pretty patel there, didn't I? Got my numbers all mixed up. £122,800. So we've reduced that cost, but we've still got that to find. So we need to work out where we're going to do it. Now, CCT have identified a grant maker who have the potential to give them £50,000 towards this project. So they've still got that 123 grand to find. What could CCT say to the fund they need 50 grand for? What we tend to see, and what I see an awful lot in my line of work, is organisations sticking that just towards the direct costs, and a bit like this quite often going, oh, well, we'll fund the salaries and we'll put it there, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But what it does is it means that you've still got £73,000 to fine, of which more are project indirect costs than direct costs. There's more overheads, the thing that people don't like funding, versus project costs. So it does make it much harder to fundraise for. Now, I'm fully aware that some funders will say, oh, we won't fund overheads, we will only fund staff salaries, for example, or won't fund, you know, there are funders who'll say this. And again, so there's nothing wrong with doing this. You might have to. If you do, you just need to understand how are you going to generate the rest of the £73,000 that we see here. If you've got those unrestricted funds through trading, through donations, then fine, I'm not bothered. But it's understanding where that money's coming from is the important point about full cost recovery. So The other option, what's the other option? Well, here, the other option is to go, well, let's slice the entire budget. Now, £50,000 is about 39% of my budget, so I'm going to use that and slice that all the way down. And I may have rounded the figures slightly, but it gives you a good idea of how that 50,000 could be apportioned across both direct costs and indirect costs. So we've multiplied each line of the budget by 39% to get the figures. So now, in our left to find column on the right-hand side, we've got a whole new project, a whole section of project, direct and indirect costs in the same proportion that we can give to other funders. But what other reasons have we got for doing it in this way? Well, there's a few, I think. So I was going to go through those quickly for you. Firstly, it's about honesty, and it's being clear to your funder how much things actually cost. So you're not selling a £127,000 project for £50,000. You're being honest and saying, this is how much it costs. You're paying for 40%. We're going to try and raise the remaining 60% we need to find from other funders. Now, if you didn't manage to do that for any reason, couldn't find the grants, couldn't secure the commissioning, whatever it was, then you can go back to your funder and explain that situation and go, I'm really sorry, we're going to have to cut the project short, we're going to cut the number of outcomes, whatever it is, in a way that allows you to do that. But you can have that dialogue. If you told them it costs 50 grand, it's fine, and it doesn't, what are you going to do? So it allows you to do that, and it also allows you to have that really, really nice project left to fund from another funder. Additionally, remember, most funders don't like being the only one in the room. They don't like being the only organisation funding an organisation. There's strength in numbers. They see other funders coming into a party as a positive thing. It means you've got, you know, other people support you. It's not, the risk is not all on them. And it's also about sustainability. If there's more than one funder in the room, then they can, you know, there's a chance that when their funding comes to an end, the project will continue because there's other funding there. So it's a nice way to show a funder, look, yes, you're important, but actually you're not so important that your funding is the be all and end all and we're overly reliant on you. So there's a few reasons to think about using a full cost recovery methodology in your work. Hopefully that's made it a bit clear about the ideas and the concept behind full cost recovery methodology and why it's important to think about, and how it's useful to think about how much your project really costs and how it works. Just one more slide on this, and I'll just pause to ask any questions about full cost recovery. So do feel free to think of any and put them in the chat box while I'm talking. Things to consider is I mean, and the point I guess I've probably tried to drum home is that full cost recovery is just a way to understand the true cost. You're not always going to get it from a funder, and I think that's important to remember. But you need to know that if you can't get it, where you're going to get from. Think about building in inflation in your budgeting as well. Just in general, even if you're not doing full cost recovery, make sure that you budget for pay rises for staff and increase in rent rates and so on year on year. Capital costs, if you are going to include any capital costs, do they make sense in the context of the project? And I mentioned this example this afternoon as well, but I think it's quite a good one, so I will do so again, which is that I once delivered some training to someone who was who's a grant maker at a charitable foundation, and she said without fail, every bid she got to the budget and there was a line saying laptop £1,000, without any clue that actually there was a need for a laptop in the project budget. So, you know, if there'd been a new member of staff, for example, that might have been justifiable, but there rarely was. There's people chancing their arm. So she'd just take a black marker pen, put a line through that and reduce the budget by £1,000. So just make sure your budget aligns with your project delivery. Make sure the capital costs and the revenue costs do. So think about, you know, if you're saying the project's running half the time, half a week, then why do you include, if you've included a full-time member of staff, you need to justify why. What's that person doing if they're not delivering the project, for example? And finally, if you budget for any contingency, which is absolutely fine, justify it, explain why there is a contingency in there. So it's basically making sure that storytelling we've talked about in the rest of these modules comes through to your budget, as well as in your need, your solutions and your impact. So we've had a couple of comments in the chat. So Rosie has said, you'd only ever considered full cost recovery for staff management before. I know, yeah, Richard had asked, not for office costs, etc. And Rosie replied, on another project we applied to National Lottery for owned capital, as we'd reached max amount, we were successful. So I think that the lesson there is really just make sure you try and use full cost recovery for the fullest sense, so you do understand it, because otherwise you're going to be left without anything to pay for those office costs. The lottery do have a certain way of doing full cost recovery, which can feel a little bit confusing, I think, personally, having used it, but it's just one way of doing it. There are other resources out there. Actually, if you just Google full cost recovery, you'll find a huge lot of them as well. Does anyone else have any questions? Did you want to unmute yourself? So is that a question, Rosie, saying if you're getting other funds in, so if you can approach National Lottery for
sorry, I wasn't very clear there. The first one, we don't need the other funding that Richard said, but it's for a it's for a new reading scheme, so it's not that we need a building for that. I guess we're obviously using our staff are using our building, but we do get other costs, so I think we didn't include that in the budget. In fact, we could do with more money for the project, because it was a 3-tier. You either got first, second, or third prize, and we got third, of which we're really grateful. So we still put in the staff cost. And then the second one was we applied to Awards for All, and we got 10,000, which we're really happy about. But that's mostly for a capital. I'll cover the whole capital bit, where they're also accruing bits of grants, from friends of libraries and a few others to build up the project. I'm just wondering if we exceed expectations in that other way, could we go back to the lottery and potentially negotiate with them to see if we can shift that around? But I don't know. We've got. I don't know. I mean,
awards for rules. Awards for all is quite different, and awards for all don't like funding, ongoing costs. They're quite clear. They're one of the funds that say it's very much for short-term projects and programs, and they will look at a full cost recovery methodology, but it's also very it's aimed at events and activities that are short term rather than long term projects. So Awards for All has slightly different rules to other lottery grants. So I think you'd have to, and that's exactly my point. You have to kind of understand what a funder will fund and won't.
No, this makes sense. This is a converting a room, so it's unlikely to have those other event related things you said. Thank you.
Okay, fab, thanks. Richard's put a link into a resource for full cost recovery as well. So if you Google, there's quite a lot out there, and I can just, when you're in the breakout rooms, actually, I've got a couple of other links of quite useful resources. I'll put those in the chat. I'll dig them out when you're in the breakout rooms later this evening. Okay, I'm going to move on then, if that's all right with everyone, and we're going to have a think about. Fantastic, you're successful, you've got your money, you've got your grant, this is brilliant. What do we do? How do we maintain relationships in order to secure funding in the future? Thing to remember is that wherever you get money from, be that commissioning, grant maker, doesn't matter, they're not just faceless organisations, there are people sitting behind them. And so a funding agreement isn't just a transaction, it's really the start of a relationship, and even more so if it's the first time funders given for you, it's that start of that journey of relationship. So we're going to think about, first off, several important things you can do to set that relationship up for success, and then we're going to think about, well, what if things aren't going brilliantly? How do you communicate with your funder in that instance? So what do you want to do to get that off on a good start? Well, first, it's all about communication. We know that, the honesty is the best policy. Communicating and open communication is the best way to make sure that everyone's on the same page. And it's really important when you're starting a relationship with a new funder that everyone's clear where you're going, that the outcomes, the objectives are really clear. It will make sure that any future issues and challenges are much easier to address. Thinking about developing that positive working relationship isn't just about, making sure reports are on time, although that is on the list, and making sure you do that. It's also about just keeping a dialogue open, and even if you don't necessarily get responses to them, sharing good news, maybe not every week, but at a regular point, so things are really significant for you as an organisation, whether that's a really good case study, positive media coverage, invitations to events or openings, that kind of thing, is just as important as keeping them in your mind and making them feel valued as a funder, as is letting them know if things aren't going particularly well, for example, if there are delays on a project. And it is important to keep the funder alert to major changes, especially if they're a significant funder. Do you want them to hear about changes for key staff or the chair of your organisation, for example, from you or from somebody else. So if there are big things changing or challenges you're facing, then you just need to let them know, because that will again make them trust you and understand that you actually are a good organisation to be supporting, and ultimately you want them to support you again. I mentioned being on top of reporting requirements. Make sure you know what deadlines are and got a plan to meet those in advance of them. No midnight canters, gathering of data and writing reports, please. And thinking longer term is really important. So we all know that it's much easier to keep funders than find new ones. So many funders will, you're more likely to get funding from a funder who already knows and trusts you. And major donors, but also quite a number of grant makers, will start with a small test gift and potentially give you larger gifts in the future. So getting it right is really key. And finally, just a note on avoiding double funding, which is, I guess, a little bit where Rose's comment about, well, things already funded can come in. And that's to make sure that you ensure that any restricted income is allocated correctly and avoiding double funding. So if, for example, you do have core funding from local authority, then you're absolutely right to include that in the full cost recovery methodology, but don't ask for that money. Essentially, you've got the funding in. So like in my example where we had our kind of in-kind gift, you'd have a column which is like already funded, and that's where that money would go. So you wouldn't be looking to fund that twice. So that's really important to understand, that two funders aren't funding the same thing. So, for example, if you had a staff post funded by one organisation, you still include that staff in your full cost recovery methodology, but you wouldn't necessarily ask for the money for them. You need to know what that true cost is, because if that funder stops funding that staff post, you'd need to replace it with more money. That's still part of the true cost. So what about when things don't go right? When we started writing this material back in February, COVID seemed a little long way up in the future, and now it feels like we're slowly coming out the other end of it, hence the face mask here. But we feel like it is probably a good time to be talking about it, because a lot of us will have had projects that have maybe stalled or delayed because of coronavirus. And so this is a good time to talk about, how do you manage it when things maybe aren't going as well and aren't going as clearly as you need to. So we've mentioned about thinking about working in partnership and open communications being the way forward, but we're going to do a short exercise just around managing those challenges to help think through how you might communicate with a funder. Now, oh, sorry, clicked on too far. You've been sent in advance the PDF, which is the handout for this, but I am going to just pop it into the chat as well now for you, so you've got it. And ultimately, it's a case study, and it's recognising December 2019, your archive received a grant of £50,000 over 2 years to digitise your records and make them available for public viewing. There's a bit more information about exactly the project on the handout, but ultimately you've got a report to give December 2020 and a final report a year later. But there have been a couple of challenges. Firstly, the basement was flooded, losing 20% of the records. And secondly, the coronavirus obviously took place and workers slowed significantly. The question is, how will you communicate the situation to the funder? And there's a few bullet points to ask you to kind of things to think about on the handout that I've shared there and you've had in advance. So I'm going to stop the share of the screen and put you into a couple of breakout rooms. Welcome back, everyone. I popped into your group a little bit, and everyone seems to be having lots of really interesting, lovely chats sort of around the topic, and not necessarily kind of answering the question, which is absolutely fine, but about your own experiences as well. So I'm taking from that you found it quite useful, and just thinking about your own experiences of working with funders. We've just got a couple of minutes. If anyone had anything really poignant or really they're taking away from that discussion you had and they wanted to share it, please feel free to put it in the chat or to unmute yourself. No, you don't have to share, it's fine.
Can you hear me?
Hey, Kathleen.
Hi. It's quite an interesting thing to be doing any project or during this time, or even before this time if you receive funding. And actually, to what extent, even though it wasn't part of the funding, because of the nature of archives, what we're doing, is part, like what is happening around the coronavirus and everything, it becomes like a kind of inherent part of any project that we might be doing. To what extent is that important,
In terms of your communication with funders, or?
Yeah, in terms of integrating it in any project that you're doing because of the impact.
Yeah, well, I think it's the honesty, isn't it? It's understanding what the impact is and being really clear and open about it. And I think reality is most funders get it completely. I mean, they understand what's going on and they're having to deal with it themselves. So I think most funders understand it. But I think it's just that point about communication and honesty and openness. It's just letting them know what the impact is and what the changes are going to be, and and also you might want to change the work you're doing depending on what it is. Actually, you might want to alter what you're doing to respond to it in a positive way and use as the catalyst. So again, that is about just being honest and having that conversation, and most funders will welcome that. I mean, and it has changed the way we live life, isn't it?
Yeah, and well, basically, what I was asking is that it becomes part of the project.
Yeah. And as I said, it depends what you're doing, but absolutely. And I think that's just embracing that and telling funders what you're doing is all you can do, and be honest about it. And Collier's just put in the comments actually that the reality is many months will also be disrupted, both in ways we foresee now, like reduced hours, and ways we can't anticipate. We may still be at the beginning while pretending the disruption is about to end. And I think that's very true. It's like we don't know what's going to happen next month. We still can't plan.
Yeah.
So I think it's about
post recovery.
Yeah,
that's the next
exactly. And it's going to keep changing, and hence that point about honesty and communication and openness, because we don't know what's going to happen. So we're going, this is where we are, this is what we're thinking, this is our plan. But do you know what? We can make that plan now and get to September, and everything goes up in the air again, and it all falls apart. So I think it is just about being completely open, honest, and everyone knows that nobody knows. It's like the Donald Rumsfeld, known unknowns and unknown unknowns and all that stuff. Yeah. Fab. Thank you, guys. That was really helpful. I'm going to move us on just to the last slide, if that's all right with everyone. And just finish off these last couple. We've got a couple more slides just to go through on stewardship, and then we've got some time for questions right at the end. So just some other points about kind of stewardship and reporting. I think sometimes when we think about stewardship, we often think about the kind of external relationships and making sure that we're stewarding our donors effectively. But actually, sometimes we also think about our internal communications and making sure that when we're thinking about stewardship, we're working out what we're going to do internally as well as externally. So think about if you do get some new funding in, a kick-off meeting or a document which allows you to share the project's objectives, plans, outputs and outcomes required, for example, to make sure that whoever is responsible for delivering that project understands what needs to happen, particularly around monitoring evaluation. And as someone who's had to scrabble around at the end of projects trying to solve problems because people haven't gathered the data correctly or kept it in the right place, and I've been the one going through the box of doom in the office trying to grab all the paperwork of evaluation forms and training programs and so on. So knowing who is going to do what, when they're going to do it, where they're going to store that information, but also importantly why. Because sometimes project delivery staff who aren't necessarily that involved with fundraising don't necessarily understand why it's important over and above just meeting the outcomes and reporting to donor. Actually, it's about that relationship, and that relationship, as we mentioned earlier, is much easier to keep than it is to salvage. It's much easier to maintain and get funding again from the same organisation than it is to go to someone new. So understanding the importance of managing the donor internally and keeping that donor happy and sharing that across the organisation is also really important. And one of the ways you might want to do it is with a stewardship plan. I'm going to show you an example on the next slide, but ultimately a stewardship plan is just something for you. So it's an internal document that gives an overview of the funder, what the relationship is, where you'd like to take that relationship, and what you're going to do in that year. So it helps you to think about deadlines and plan ahead, remember why decisions have been made, and particularly in relation to any handover. So whether that's an internal handover or, as some of you were talking about in the exercise, staff turnover and how when staff leave. If it's a document, this makes it really clear where you are with a grant, but more than just within the grant, with the donor particularly, it can really help you. So thinking about the future for that donor, so that you can think about, well, where do we go beyond that? It might be something you only update once every 12 months, or less. It depends on the donor relationship as to where you are. So what does that look like? I've just got a slide to show an example of the kind of thing you might have in a stewardship plan. So we've got a summary section, if you're given a grant, what that looks like, how long it runs for, what the goal for the plan is. So why are you writing the stewardship plan? Is it to make sure the funder is absolutely delighted with a great project? Is it about building a closer relationship with the funder so you can go back for more money? Or is it about using the donor to leverage other opportunities? What's the background of the phone? Any information? Now remember, if that includes any pertinent details, so personal data, then make sure that is relevant, up to date and stored safely in line with GDPR, and that you make sure you account for that in any privacy notice. So for example, if it's legitimate interest, you're clear on that. Key contacts and grant conditions, so there's the formal requirements, and then you might have a plan, and you can see some of the examples month by month in here, which might be formal things that like things you have to do, 6-month report due, for example, but it might be also things you want to do to keep the donor engaged, so sending a copy of annual report, invites to a drinks reception, and so on. So it just gives some milestones in there for you, but also anyone else involved in the project, and also that handover. The useful way to think about what's the future of the relationship with the donor. And that, I think, is my final slide of my final module, delivered for the final time. So thank you so much. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, so I'll get rid of the slides and open up the floor, stroke chat box, to you guys. So really, it's over to you in terms of any questions, any thoughts. I'm going to attempt to put my video on so I can see you all. If my sound quality goes bad, Richard will let me know and tell me to turn it off. And we'll see how we get on. Richard said you can't not have your video on. People think you're not really there. I am. So any questions, do use the chat, or put your hand up and wave at me about anything we covered today or any other module. Everyone's racking their brains now. I'm thinking of a good question to ask Leah. Brilliant, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Rosie. Glad you like the idea of the stewardship plan. Okay.
Well, it's really important, isn't it? Because I sort of help write the funds, or I ghost write them, and then I kind of lose track. And so when I'm asked to contact a funder to say, to tell them about our sort of difficulties with something, or say for example COVID, the funder doesn't want to speak to me because they don't really know who I am, which is just, I'm not bothered about that. But also the internal, when you've handed it over and remembering deadlines, etc., having that one document, I think, would be really helpful. So and also helping you think about your future, because you're the one who's probably going to have to go back to that funder again in the future for more money. So for you to understand, and you can keep a log of those kind of conversations as well on that plan, so that when you do go back to them, you're like, oh yeah, that conversation I'd forgotten we had 11 months ago. Yeah, brilliant. That sounds like it's a useful tool for some of you. Fantastic. Thanks, Rosie. That's okay.
Anyone else got any questions, or is everyone just as hot and sweaty as me? I want to go outside. Kathleen looks like she's wearing a jumper. I can't be wearing a jumper in this heat. Have you got air conditioning? I'm embarrassed there now. I think
Kathleen, if you're saying anything.
I've made her giggle. So yeah, thank you. Brilliant. Julianne thinks I've answered everything. Fantastic. That's good to know. I'm sure you am an advanced bid writer. Oh, you will be now, Zoe. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I think I'm glad you've really enjoyed them. Thank you so much for your input over the last 4 modules. It's been great having you, and glad you've enjoyed them. And yeah, look forward to your fundraising in the future and seeing you all do wonderful things. Yeah, brilliant. I think you can stop recording, Richard.